Welcome to ING's Think Aloud, where we try to make sense of the world in the most unbanky way we can. In today's episode,
this pandemic has generated a social and economic crisis, a world of work crisis of quite unprecedented proportions. We have never seen anything quite like what has gone on in the last 6 months.
Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labour Organization, says while governments around the world have invested $10 trillion to keep people in work, there's a risk that financial support is withdrawn too soon. In Europe, many job retention schemes are set to end around the turn of the year, suggesting that unemployment will finally start to reflect some of the huge economic damage caused by COVID-19. But just how bad could things get? I'm Rebecca Byrne, and today I'm joined by Carsten Brzeski, ING's Chief Economist for the Eurozone and Global Head of Macro, to discuss his latest findings on the job market and what could be in store in the months ahead. Carsten, the unemployment rate in Europe has barely gone up throughout the pandemic, unlike in the US. And you say in your article this week that the government programs have been a big reason for this. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it is an interesting feature of this crisis that the unemployment in the Eurozone has hardly gone up. So we're still slightly below 8% right now in the Eurozone, while in the US we were at double-digit levels at around 15%, I think, at the peak. In Europe, the main reason is that governments have highly subsidized the labor market. And this is what we know as short-time work schemes. The funny thing is, these things actually started in Germany more than 100 years ago. So they started, I think, to do a bit of securing jobs in the mining industry during a crisis. And the whole concept behind this is that companies don't have to fire people. They put people on shorter working hours, and they are partly subsidized by the government. So the employers are subsidized, the salary of the employees are partly subsidized. And why do they do that? So not only because they are so kind, but also because they think, okay, this is only a short-lived crisis, and the costs of firing people right now and then rehiring people after the crisis is much higher than putting some subsidies in the labor market right now. And we had this during the financial crisis. It was a huge success in Germany, 2008, 2009, really helped the economy going through the crisis very quickly. It was also copycat by other European economies. And now I think we're at a stage in which this is probably next to German cars, the big success of the German industry, of the German economy, exporting short-time work schemes. Almost all European countries have introduced something like these schemes. And in late spring, we even had at the European level an initiative called SURE. This is giving out loans to governments which want to introduce or which want to extend these short-term work schemes in their own countries.
But it's not just state support, though, is it, that's keeping the jobless rate artificially low? There are other factors as well. For example, how the jobless rate is calculated.
Yeah, that was interesting because when we looked at the data, we thought, okay, well, this is all only about these short-term work schemes, but no, there was more to it. And call these the frustrated employees, the frustrated worker, because in a couple of countries, especially in Southern European economies, we saw that people simply drop out of the labor market. So they lose their job and they don't register as unemployed. So this is a phenomenon which we normally see more in the US than in Europe. But here it has really happened. We saw this in Italy, saw this in Spain, in France, and we also kind of tweaked the numbers. And if we were to include all these dropouts into the calculations of an unemployment rate, the unemployment rate would already be 1 to 1.5 percentage points higher than the current 7.7, 7.9%.
Well, what's your forecast for unemployment heading into next year when people start to look for work again and a lot of these short-time work schemes come to an end? When will we see the peak?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And this was actually the reason why we started to look into this whole issue here with this research note. Because these short-term work schemes will expire. Depends a little bit on the countries. So the first countries will see them expire already towards the end of this year. Other countries have extended them until March next year. France is now even going until 2022. So this is an enormous extension. So the question is, what's going to happen afterwards? We first thought, okay, let's look at a situation in which we do not have these short-term work schemes. So how high would unemployment then look like? And there we looked into good old economics textbooks. You have something which is called Okun's law. Mr. Okun, I think in the 60s, developed a formula in which he said, okay, how much economic growth do you need to increase your employment in the labor market? So we used this role and said, okay, what is the relationship between the GDP growth developments and the labor market? And if we then forget about all these short-term work schemes, the fact that we're coming from an enormous crisis, going into a V-shaped rebound, and then going into a recovery, we could see the unemployment rate in Europe to peak somewhere at 11% next year. This would only be based on our GDP growth assumptions.
You mentioned that some of the government work schemes have already been extended, but could they be extended even further, maybe for political reasons? Because I know, for example, there's an election coming up in Germany. Could that have an impact?
Definitely. And I think we will see that more and more European governments will somehow have to balance between this nice, very attractive instrument of wage subsidy of short-time work schemes, because it almost looks like, it almost comes for free. Well, costs a little bit in the future, increases debt, but it keeps the economy afloat, keeps people happy. Especially when you look at the German case, I think that is a very interesting one. It's not only that these short-time work schemes will expire in March or in the first quarter next year. We also had this VAT reduction this year, which will be reversed next year. So we would see an increase in VAT again next year. Plus, there also is a very special German thing with bankruptcies. So currently, companies are not even allowed to register a bankruptcy. This could only happen in fall this year, and there are some politicians arguing, well, let's extend this until next year. So then you would be in an election year with higher VAT rates, with higher unemployment, and a huge surge in bankruptcies. Well, this doesn't sound like a very attractive package for politicians. So yes, I think there is a chance that these schemes will be extended. In the German case, maybe even until the elections. And it doesn't come as a surprise that actually this week we had the two governing parties already kind of suggesting that they would be open for such an idea. On top of that, we also have in Germany a discussion right now about maybe reducing the working week, go from a 5-day work week to a 4-day work week. So I think we will see more of these discussions across Europe, which would then in turn, and we're economists, we have to predict the future, which then would also have to lead to a downward revision of our unemployment forecast, because obviously if governments play around and extend these schemes, the unemployment rate would increase much less than we currently assume.
Right. But you mentioned in your report that the pandemic has been the catalyst for structural change. So presumably that means that some jobs may be lost forever. They may never be coming back.
Right. And I think, before we record, we're just talking a bit about our vacation. And the tourist industry is obviously an industry which will suffer, or which is already suffering, and which will continue to suffer from the COVID-19 crisis. Restaurants, service providers, retail stores. So I think there is already a very long list of sectors which will continue to suffer. On top of that, we also saw it already prior to COVID-19. There were some structural changes, transitions going on in the European economy. So we're moving away from this manufacturing-based economy towards a service-oriented economy. And this structural change normally always comes with job losses, at least in one sector, and there might be then job gains in other sectors. So now with this short-term work scheme, obviously this structural change, this transition will be interrupted. could be delayed, and could lead then to a situation in which, in the short term, it is a fantastic instrument, a fantastic tool to tackle a cyclical downswing. But it is also a tool which runs the risk of postponing highly needed or required structural change. And so therefore, if when we also start to look at, just making the prediction again, there are quite some announcement already from companies across Europe, with restructurings over the next years. And when you look at so a couple of examples, anecdotes where, in the airline industry, airports, where a couple of companies have already announced that around 1/4 of the jobs currently subject to short-term work schemes could disappear in the medium run. And so this gives already some idea. So 1/4 in the mostly hit sectors would be a lot. So let's assume this will not be as much, for the entire economies, but I think it is fair to think that maybe some 10-15% of the jobs or the employment currently subject to short-term work schemes could disappear for good.
One interesting thing I found in your report was you looked at what would happen to the job market if the government had never stepped in to subsidize it. And what's surprising is that although unemployment would have been higher, it's maybe not as high as people think, given the scale of the crisis. Why is this?
Yeah, it was interesting when we always compare crises with other crises, and we quite have a series of crises in Europe, and the last one is 2008, 2009, then 2010, 2012 Euro crisis, and back then unemployment in the Eurozone topped at something like 13%. According to our estimates, we would not reach this peak even if we were to go for a world without any single short-term work schemes. And why is this? In my view, first of all, this period 2008 until 2012-13 was a period in which we had several crises in Europe. Financial crisis, banking crisis, Euro crisis. We even were in a double dip recession in Europe. So a very prolonged, subdued period for many European countries, especially for the Southern European countries. On top of that, we had other policy reactions. Remember, we all know this period 2008 to 2012-13 was this period in which austerity measures and structural reforms were the dominant policy prescription in Europe. So also clearly not policy instruments which are supportive for the labor market, but which also lead to an increase in unemployment. And I think these are the biggest differences. So this current crisis is hopefully short-lived with, like we discussed, some structural longer-term implications for the economies, but hopefully not so much for growth. And we have a completely different policy reaction this time around than we had between 2008 and 2013.
So what does all this mean for consumer spending and for the shape of the recovery, both this year and into next year?
Yeah, for consumer spending, these short-term work schemes have been really a blessing, because they are instrumental in supporting consumer spending. These are the reasons why we saw also in the first month now, since the lifting of the lockdown measures, that private consumption in Europe surged more than industrial activity, for example. So obviously, looking beyond this initial rebound, at least until the end of this year, so at least until we see the first schemes expiring, they should still be extremely supportive for consumption. Obviously, the closer we get to the expiration dates, people will be more cautious, will be more concerned. So what does it mean for me? Will I still have a job once this short-time work scheme has expired? Going into next year, I think the discussion we had here on the German situation, which is very specific given that it's going to be an election year in Germany. But I think if you look at these elements that we will see in Germany next year, it also means that there is a risk of a double dip. And then so far we've always said, okay, initially we see this V-shaped rebound, then the whole thing will lose some momentum, and the recovery will be something like the Nike swoosh. Yeah, I think this still holds, but there will be a transition, and the transition hits in once the schemes expire, and in a case there might not be a vaccine by then yet, we run the risk of having a double dip scenario in Europe.
Okay, Carsten Brzeski, Chief Economist for the Eurozone and Global Head of Macro. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. It was a pleasure.
This podcast has been prepared by ING solely for information purposes, irrespective of a particular user's means, financial situation, or investment objective. The information does not constitute investment recommendation, and nor is it investment, legal, or tax advice, or an offer or solicitation to purchase or sell any financial instrument. Read more at think.ing.com/content-.